Good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth and final day of the American Philosophical Society's virtual symposium, Evidence, the Use and Abuse of Data. I'm so glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the APS. This afternoon's 1 p.m. panel is our fifth panel of the symposium and is entitled Data in the Digital Age. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society has long been a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who we feel needs the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Given the many different ways that our founder, Benjamin Franklin, used evidence and information in his scientific research, in his publishing, and in his diplomatic work, we felt this week's conference on the use and abuse of data in the past, present, and looking ahead to the future would be particularly fitting. Before I introduce our commentator for today, please let me just say a few words about the format. Speakers today will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes about their work. This is an abridgment of their longer work, and we invite you to go to the conference website and download the full paper. In a few minutes, I will put the password for accessing those papers in the chat function. After their presentations, our commentator will begin the conversation with some quick thoughts, and we'll throw out some questions for our presenters. Then we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. I invite all of you to use the Q&A function, which you should see in the bottom navigation bar of Zoom, to ask questions. Ask a question at any point in the talk today. Don't feel like you have to wait till towards the end when we have the Q&A. So as the question comes to you, go ahead and type it out. You'll see on the slide on the screen right now that we have some social media for today's conference. Please keep the dialogue going beyond this afternoon's session. Use our conference hashtag, APS Evidence. If you do post something, put our name on there as well. If we have a Twitter account, we have an Instagram account, and we also have a Facebook account. We are recording these talks, and we hope to be posting them on YouTube in the coming weeks, so check back for more. Our commentator for today's panel is Jamie Cohen-Cole, who is an associate professor at George Washington University and has held fellowships at the Fishbein Center for History of Science at the University of Chicago, the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University, and the Center for Humanities at Wesleyan University. His first book, The Open Mind, Cold War Politics and the Sciences of Human Nature, chronicles the development and promulgation of a scientific vision of the rational, creative, open-minded self. His current book project examines the cultural history of developmental psychology and its efforts to define human nature through the very idea that very young children can be best understood if they are treated as practicing scientists. Thank you so much, Jamie, for being here today, and I'm going to turn it over to you to give some introductions.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank the organizers and the panelists for setting up this both the session and the longer conference, and also sharing some really rich, really interesting papers with us. So in order, I'm going to introduce the panelists for today's conversation, or this afternoon's conversation. First up, we have Mark Turin, who's an anthropologist, linguist, and radio presenter, associate professor at the University of British Columbia. He's cross-appointed with the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies and the Department of Anthropology. From 2014 to 2018, Dr. Turin served as the chair of the First Nation and Endangered Languages program, and from 2016 to 18 as the co-director of the university's new Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies. Mark directs both the World Oral Literature Project, which is an urgent global initiative to document and make accessible endangered oral literatures before they disappear without record, and also the Digital Himalaya Project, which he co-founded in 2000 as a platform to make multimedia resources from the Himalayan region widely available online. Next up, Jennifer Brooke Pierce is an associate professor in the School of Library and Information Science at the University of Iowa, where she has a joint appointment for the Center for the Book. Her latest book, Narratives, Nerdfighters, and New Media, will be released from University of Iowa Press in 2020. She's won research fellowships from the American Antiquarian Society, Winter Museum, Library and Gardens, and most recently the Der Grumman Children's Literature Collection at the University of Southern Mississippi. Finally, Joshua Sternfeld will be presenting as an independent scholar. His publications have appeared in American Historical Review, American Archivist, and the Journal of Digital Humanities. His earlier research and publications explored the concept of digital historiography and the interaction of digital technology with historical practice. His publication AHR, Harlem, Crime, Soapbox Speeches in the Beauty Parlors, was a part of an inaugural exchange reviewing digital history. His work is informed in part by his work as Senior Program Officer with the National Endowment for Humanities, where he coordinates the Division of Preservation and Access Research and Development Grant Program. Before arriving at the endowment, he was assistant director and postdoctoral scholar for the UCLA Center for Information as Evidence and Information Studies Department. Well, with that, I'll turn the session over to our panelists, and I look forward to hearing their introductions and the discussion that follows.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I'd like to start by offering my appreciation to Adriana, Kyle, and all those at the APS who worked tirelessly to make this event possible, and done so, as we know, under very challenging circumstances. I've learned a huge amount from the panels this week, and the discussion has really helped me to further my thinking on questions of data and evidence. Next slide, please. I'm joining this conversation from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. The APS acted to use its influence to show support for the protest movement against systemic racism by scheduling Wednesday's session. Those of us with the security of stable jobs and tenured appointments need to do more to mobilize our privilege and affect the transformation in our own institutions. So the motto of the APS, which you see here, is not an empty slogan, but rather a true commitment to building a more equitable scholarly community. Next slide, please. Almost 20 years ago, a group of 4 anthropologists and historians set out to explore new methods for collecting, protecting, and connecting historical, anthropological collections relating to the Himalayan region in ways that would widen access to those materials through digital platforms. Sarah Harrison, Alan McFarlane, Sarah Schneiderman, and I named this pilot project Digital Himalaya. It's a placeholder that's since come to stick. We began by digitizing older sets of ethnographic data held in university collections across Europe to protect them from obsolescence and decay, forward migrate them as new standards emerged, and share them with originating communities in the Himalayan region and with scholars everywhere through the web and other digital media. Next slide, please. Anthropological knowledge is usually derived from ethnographic data gathered through fieldwork, and fieldwork is an inherently communicative, subjective, historically contingent, and necessarily imperfect event. So what is the evidentiary basis for anthropological knowledge? Ethnographic understanding usually happens after the fact rather than in the moment itself. Hastrup describes the intellectual conceit of ethnography. She writes, "While it lasts, it's a radical experience of estrangement and relativism. Afterward, it becomes memory and the backbone of objectivism." The elephant in the room here is that at the very center of anthropological evidence making lies the monograph or the academic article. After all, before fieldwork can become science, it has to be transformed into text. Where does that leave the rich audiovisual materials that ethnographers have collected and continue to collect, and that we in the Digital Himalaya project were planning to digitize and share through the web? Next slide, please. For the first half of the 20th century, while the ostensible purpose of ethnographic film was educational, there's no evidence at all that ethnographic films were ever used in teaching, nor were they very often cited as data sources in academic writing. This was an aspect of the ethnographic endeavor that had been systematically undervalued by the academy. By way of illustration, when Christoph von Truder-Heimendorf, who you see here on the left, whose exceptional film collection we worked with, mentioned to one of his mentors, anthropological founding father Malinovsky in 1935, that he intended to photograph in the field, the grandfather of ethnography dismissed this as a form of tourist activity, below the dignity of an anthropologist and only of decorative use. Simply put, film was not considered an appropriate tool for the production of anthropological knowledge. Next slide, please. After the Second World War, the BBC and others were looking to commission ethnographic films to quench the inexhaustible appetite that new television audiences had for romantic travelogues, but they lacked the networks to make such films themselves. The solution was a creative arrangement. Television companies would provide the film stock and cover some of the travel costs and costs associated with fieldwork, while von Futter-Heimendorf and others would act as their contracted filmmakers. On his return to Europe, Futter-Heimendorf delivered the reels to the commissioning body, who then, through a process of cutting and editing, would composite the raw footage into dramatic sounding documentaries with the titles such as The Land of the Gurkhas or The Men Who Hunted Heads. In the editing process, television producers mixed up ethnic groups from different districts, even different countries. They laid a Beethoven soundtrack over footage of Himalayan rice paddies, and they added an authoritative voiceover, preferably from someone like David Attenborough. They would then air the finished documentary to public acclaim. What little evidentiary authority these films might have had at the outset was shredded in the process, making these broadcast films far less interesting than the raw footage to which we had been given access through the project. Next slide, please. Through Digital Himalaya, exciting collaborations began to take place. The custodians of these collections in the colonial holding institutions in Europe had only very limited knowledge about the footage that they held, based on a few quickly scribbled notes in a film canister or on an ancient accession form. While back in the Himalayan region, descendants of the individuals who were featured in the films often had no way of knowing that such footage even existed. When we approached communities in Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet, and northern India, and you see us here in northern India, in Sikkim, about the existence of these visual records, all of the people we spoke to were very eager to view them and then also have permanent copies of the films and photographs of their ancestors. Relationships of trust began to develop out of a process that has since come to be referred to as digital return. Next slide, please. Through collaborations that are mediated through visual records, members of historically marginalized and ethnographically scrutinized communities can become revalued as knowledge holders and experts. The insights offered by community members are of immense value to the holding institutions. They contribute rich information and context to historically underdocumented collections. Yet, while it's certainly good to broaden access and to work against entrenched colonial models of knowledge production, I think we should remain healthily skeptical about what degree of representational equality is actually reached in such remediations. Next slide, please. As the project has aged and the internet has matured, I've observed a changing perception of what Digital Himalaya is. Is it an archive of fieldwork data? If so, by whom is it curated? And by what standards are materials included or excluded? Or is Digital Himalaya more of an archive, a constantly growing collection of collections that could never have existed other than through a web platform? Next slide, please. A fair amount of the correspondence we receive comes from scholars looking to publish in one of the 30 journals that we host online, even though we make it quite clear on our website that we are simply the online hosts, not editors and not publishers. But as digital publishing has become the norm and open access initiatives become more widespread, perhaps we are in a way fulfilling part of the role of publisher, if only through dissemination, so that this conflation of roles is then to be understood and expected. As search tools have become more effective and more pervasive, we find that our collections are accessed and downloaded without the user ever having visited or even knowing about our website. As media sharing sites have become more dominant on the web, my thinking about the importance of our own website has changed profoundly. Next slide, please. I'm becoming more uneasy about the sustainability of digital projects. Over Digital Himalaya's 20 years, I've come to the conclusion that if the data and the material collections with which we've worked are safe, then the structure that holds them together can be permitted to decay as new platforms take their place. In this, then, digital Himalaya may just be a simple lesson in impermanence and non-attachment, letting go of our now quite dated website so the collections may live on through a process of rebirth and renewal. The data will endure. Their form will change over time. And as we know, the digital is just as transient and just as fleeting as other forms of existence. Next slide, please. Events are happenings of social significance, writes Hastrup. Might we then ask whether evidence is data of social significance? Now that the pool of users, of consumers and creators of anthropology is finally widening to include the descendants of the enumerated citizens so problematically referred to as informants by our disciplinary ancestors, the very fabric of what constitutes social significance also changes. And it offers the potential to be more inclusive of those who've been historically marginalized and devoiced. Can ethnographic films, previously consigned to the classroom as a babysitting tool for tired instructors, assume a new life? In Digital Ethnography, Underberg and Zorn note that in the early days of interdisciplinary collaboration, the main question was, how much computer science do anthropologists need to know? What they don't go on to say, but would certainly be my next question, is this: how much anthropology do computer scientists need to know? Thank you.
Hello. So my focus during our time together today is what happens when you examine thousands and thousands of voices of people who are describing their experiences as readers. And I'm interested in that both in their voices collectively and individually. Next slide, please. So in recent years, I've become invested in an online community known as Nerdfighteria. I've participated in Nerdfighteria both as a community member, and I've also begun to study it as someone who is interested in how people engage with books and reading, because these are very much values and activities that are prevalent in this online community. The book that I've developed as a result, Narratives, Nerdfighters, and New Media, is one of a number of recent humanities projects that depend on large data sets. And so in this, one of my central concerns is how to be sensitive and respectful of each of the many, many voices whose ideas make up this thing called a data set. So my concern here is how we regard and engage with the material that we call evidence. Next slide, please. One way of thinking about this for me has been to contrast the work that I and other scholars are doing with humanities work and large data sets with some of the earlier studies of reading that have been able to focus on a single reader. And so one of these studies that is very notable in a number of respects is Carlo Ginzburg's The Cheese and the Worms, first published in Italian in 1976. It has been translated into at least a dozen languages and reissued, I believe, most recently in 2013. And part of what, aside from its publication history, is so distinctive about The Cheese and the Worms is that Ginsburg gets to focus on this one lone reader, on Minocchio, this 16th century miller who unfortunately attracts the attention of the Inquisition because of what he reads and because of his willingness to talk and to share his ideas about reading, which diverge, of course, from what the church has to say. Among the plentiful positive reviews of this book, many of them praise Ginsburg for bringing Minocchio to life, for making him a lively and living person. And I've given you just this one quote here. The reader who has followed Dr. Ginsburg in his wanderings through the labyrinthine mind of the Miller of Friuli will take care of this strange and quirky old man with genuine regret. Next slide, please. So unlike Ginsburg, I don't have a single compelling reader whom I can bring to life. Instead, what I have is Nerdfighteria, and any way you try to account for the size of this community, it is simply massive. Novelists John and Hank Green have had a YouTube channel, Vlogbrothers, since 2007. At present, they have more than 3 million subscribers. Each of them are New York Times bestselling authors, and they have other media like podcasts that also have listeners. So, I mean, basically the community of Nerdfighteria and the people who create and document reading experiences as members of that community can be large, even a small subset of people in that community responding to surveys can be large. So there is a Nerdfighteria census run by the YouTube channel, the Vlogbrothers, and it is one of the things that gives us some documentation about Nerdfighteria as readers. That survey traditionally includes questions like, what are you reading right now? And who is your favorite author? So, you know, I've given you one approximate set of or data set size. Some of them are smaller, but even the smaller ones, again, you know, can be quite substantial. Next slide, please. So when you have these large data sets, like the ones that I've been working with, there are some things that are relatively easy to do computationally. You can see what titles people, a number of people list as things they are reading. You can see which authors float to the top in their list of favorites across the community and things like that. But in addition to these numerics, I wanted to see what else Nerdfighteria and Nerdfighters would tell us about reading. Yesterday, we had colleagues who talked with us about bad data and messy data sets. And if these are interests of yours, Nerdfighteria is the place to be, because Nerdfighteria and Nerdfighters tend to produce a fairly complex data set. So when we have a question like, what are you reading right now? A straightforward answer might be The Living Mountain, or The Living Mountain and the World of Technology. But Nerdfighters don't often do that. Well, about a third of the time, they'll do that for us. Well, almost 1/3 of respondents will give us something other than a straightforward fill-in-the-blank type answer for these questionnaires. And so it places a great deal of importance on not just running computational queries on the data set, but on reading the data set to see what it is that they have to say. And that, you know, is something that I've discussed both in the paper for APS and in my forthcoming book. So next slide, please. And I would say, as sort of a broad generalization about what the people whose voices make up this data set have to say, is that being a reader and being a member of an online community means many different things, and that what we see in the voices of people who respond to the Nerdfighteria census is that they're telling us things about reading that we don't necessarily see in other places. Next slide, please. So just to summarize and conclude here, I would argue that when we're dealing with these large data sets, we need dialogue between qualitative and quantitative techniques in order to truly understand contemporary reading and to come to grips with the depths of these large data sets. So thank you.
Well, I'm back, and so I guess at this point I would want to ask a questions just to kick off the discussion. I'm going to keep my comments and questions quite brief so that there will be an opportunity both for the presenters but also for the audience to offer their own questions as well. So first of all, I want to say again, thank all of the presenters for some really fascinating observations, and analyses, both in their presentations and in their longer papers. And so my question for you collectively, which I hope will help frame, a chance to talk more about your papers, is if you could draw out, in some ways, even more detailed than you've at least said right now, and some of this is in the papers, but not everybody will have read those. Some of these, there's still some gaps in the papers in which you could detail this question more. So the question is, what difference does the fact that we're talking about digital and the algorithms at this moment make? So specifically, what differences it is. So I want to indicate for each of these papers why are places where this could be drawn out a little bit. So in the case of Mark's paper, so we heard of the important work of digitizing, collecting, and distributing previous work in ethnography and films to multiple publics, including returning the materials to the originators of these, in some sense, the owners of these materials. So the question is in what sense is this data, we think a little bit about how, in what sense this practice is different from previous efforts to catalog in a non-digital way. So I'm reminded in some at this moment of Rebecca Lemov's account of the human relation area files, which were recorded on microfilms, and she refers to it as a kind of a database, and the title of her book, Database of Dreams, in part because the materials in the human relation area files included the accounts of dreams of, if I may, informants, right? So, what's the difference in this case? And part of the reason why I'm asking this is that Lemov was engaged in a historical project of a group of scholars whose part of the argument of that project was to suggest that much of our current work on the digital database and databases, big data and algorithms are relatively similar to things that practices, knowledge-making practices and historical practices in the humanities and more broadly in the sciences that have been going on for centuries. Now, these historians would want to make this argument in part because people who are engaged in these activities were studying the ancient world, the medieval world, the early modern world. Right, so, so that's part one. So for Jennifer, I was thinking as I was as I read your paper and hearing your comments, I was, and particularly your point about the diversity of readers, right, and their reactions to the things that they were reading, right. So, and you have the problem that none of these individual readers are as interesting as the one. Perhaps is interesting. You don't maybe know enough about these individual readers in order to give an account like Carlo Ginzburg, right? Perhaps they would be as interesting as Minocchio if you knew as much as Ginzburg did about Minocchio. Okay, so still, we have some other cases that are in between Ginzburg and your moment, right? So so in here I'm thinking about Janice Radaway's account of the readers of romance novels. And again, this is a different community, but the central finding there is these people don't read like you might expect if you're, a standard literary scholar, standard in the sense of the people who would approach these kind of questions before Radaway introduces her approach, right? So the question then again is, what difference does the digital make in this case, either to the readers that they're living in a digital world, or to the scholarly endeavor?
Should I dive in, Jamie, in response to your first point? Maybe just to say, I really appreciate what you said, and I'm just sort of thinking through perhaps one of the key issues as I identify it is that privileging the analog, so let's kind of just put the analog and digital somewhere in kind of an opposition, although that's maybe a little too vulgar as well. But privileging the analog is a luxury that most communities who have been the subjects of anthropological interest cannot afford. You mentioned the human relations area files, right? So to get to those, if you're coming from another part of the world, you have to get a visa to the States, get yourself up to New Haven, get from the New Haven train station to locate where these things are, make an appointment, come in, find a place to stay. All of those things are incredibly taxing and expensive. And I think these digital interventions and opportunities, not that they reset everything, but they have the potential to create more informed, rich knowledge networks and democratize maybe very basic access. So I think that's probably the key issue that I find so interesting, which is that the collectors themselves could never have imagined that one day this would happen. And the holding institutions didn't really have ethical or practical structures to facilitate it, but were also not opposed to the opportunity for deeper engagement. So perhaps that's the biggest single thing that I'd like to identify as distinct that comes with the digital.
Yeah, so if I were to talk about the implications of the digital, I think one of the most facile ways of responding to that is that the people who are making up Nerdfighteria, the people who are interacting and talking to one another as readers, they don't have to be geographically proximate. You know, so Jamie mentioned Janice Radway's study, and I forget what her name was for the town. Was it Smithton? You know, where she had her 10 or 12 readers, right? So those were all people who lived in geographic proximity, whereas with this digital and online community, people can be anywhere. And there's also, because of some other features of the survey, there's also less restriction, I guess, on chronology, on time. Historically, these surveys have not simply opened up at a nice, well, they've opened up at a nice defined point, but they haven't always closed at a nice defined point. So sometimes, you know, like you'll have like a 2014 study or survey, and it'll still be collecting data because it's open. As long as you haven't answered that survey, people were still answering and responding to that survey in 2017. So it's both messy and it's rich and it's dynamic, I think, in a way that some other types of work, well, it's just different. I won't say it's more so, I'll say it's different than.
At this point, I'm going to be, I guess, moderating or passing on questions from the audience that appeared in the Q&A. So there's a question from Michael Ng from Mark Turin. It goes as follows. It's interesting that the media corporations like the BBC relied on anthropological networks. What do you make of the reliance, given anthropology's own reliance on, as well as expansion of colonial networks?
Right on. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. It's I mean, it's no surprise, and I think it is worth calling out. I think the way to look at it, in my understanding, is this allegiance of expedience, which has locked different actors together, who are all deeply rooted in very authoritative and hegemonic models of knowledge transfer, particularly after the war. And you think of the BBC, the World Service. I mean, is that not an imperial project in and of itself? There was a fluidity between broadcasters, scholars, and government. And I think that's a really key point, which is that it was not a particularly brave thing or unusual thing of the national broadcaster to do. The Bavarian TV did it, Austrian TV did it too. They leveraged their networks and they put a bit of modest funding in to support the collection of content. What's so intriguing is, of course, that the way that they packaged it and broadcast it would create worlds that didn't exist. I mean, loosely we could say none of these projections really exist anyway, but when they are so pieced together from communities of different parts of a country and maybe even beyond that into something that is a narrative whole, it created an audience for a kind of ethnography, which even the ethnographers themselves, locked in very traditional ways of practicing, were not always comfortable with. So it was a tricky relationship, but one that I think is certainly worthy of interrogating and further study. So thank you very much for that question.
So a follow-on to this is one that pulls together several of the questions that we have, and it comes down to this really. To what extent does the way that the data is organized or structured in the digital form compel human agents reacting to them to behave in particular ways. So judges responding to Compass, or so on, or so on. So this is again directed to the three of you. So to Jennifer's end, does it make a difference that it's digital? Does that make it, as far as the size of the community that you're talking about? Does that help it be as large as it is, or is it a matter of the fact that people are reading this a particular genre and that it's as large as it is?
I think it's more the digitality than genre, certainly.
Well, with that, we've reached the end of our session, and I wanted to thank all of the presenters and the audience members, and to remind everybody that there's a final keynote discussion at 3 o'clock.